In the United States anyway, the political leadership of the country is predominantly, overwhelmingly from this top 20%, which tends to have educational privilege, and over the past 50 years has become much more insulated from the bottom 80%. And that's the leadership of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. That's the leadership of labor unions, and it's the leadership even of a lot of radical social movements. Thanks to everybody who's been organizing this conference. I've really been enjoying my time here. It's been great learning more about some of the efforts that are like ours, but happening in Canada. And I'm also excited to follow Sarada and Sean's discussion on populism. I'm actually really going to be talking quite a bit about populism as well. But from the perspective of a grassroots organizer in Pennsylvania, who is also a nerdy sociologist at the same time. So I want to introduce myself for a minute. I am from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is where I live now, once again, but I was gone for about 20 years. I was raised rural, living on a farm, working class, very conservative, very religious. We went to church many times a week, and I went to Mennonite school. And so I'm kind of an unlikely, I'm not a usual suspect in terms of my upbringing to be in a space like this. And by the time I was 17, I was hitchhiking across the country, and by the time I was 18, I was like headlong in radical activist spaces, and people have often asked me, how did that happen? And it's kind of difficult to say, to be honest, because it's kind of random. It's just a series of accidents. And that has always sat with me, because being in major metropolitan areas for most of my adult life, being in liberal and left spaces, I noticed a way that a lot of people around me would talk about the areas like the one where I'm from. And I also just knew that there are a lot more people like me who had progressive dispositions but were not being engaged, and it didn't have the series of accidents that kind of led me into progressive politics. So I started to become a bit disillusioned with the activist spaces that I had found such a home and such a community in. This is in the late 90s, early 2000s. So I was part of the global justice movement. I was part of a lot of community organizing on criminal justice reform. I was involved with campaigns with the American Indian movement and Earth First and neighborhood coalitions. And something started to bother me over time, and it was this feeling like we were too small and like we were talking to ourselves. This feeling of insularity. I don't know if anyone else in this room has ever felt that. But that's what kind of led me to eventually start the organization that I now direct called Beyond the Choir. And it really started as a project and an inquiry into this insularity, trying to understand why were progressive circles that I was part of, why were activist circles so insular, and were they always this way, or was this a new thing historically, and what was it about? And so that led to an analysis about the emergence of activism, and I talk about this in the first chapter of my book. We often take for granted this term, activism, activist, but it's actually a term that people didn't use 50 years ago. They only started using it about 50 years ago, and it really came into the lexicon in the 70s and 80s. And so we kind of project backward onto history. We'll call the abolitionists activists or the suffragettes activists, but they literally didn't have this word. And so what? Didn't they just have other words to describe the same thing? Well, I make the case in my research and my writing that no, there is something different about this concept of activism that's emerged over the past 50 years, and there's something detrimental to the goals of the people who are in those spaces. And the thing that's detrimental is these spaces have become class insular. So this isn't just a problem of the left, this is a problem of how neoliberal society has structured people generally. And there's a class-based insularity where the top 10 to 20%, there's a chasm between them and the bottom 80 to 90%. And this is different than the 1% problem, and it's different than the 0.1% problem. A researcher named Richard Reeves wrote a book called Dream Hoarders that gets at this. There was a really good article in The Atlantic about this problem. But long and short is that the leadership, the political leadership, in the United States anyway, I don't want to project onto Canada because I don't know enough, but in the United States anyway, the political leadership of the country is predominantly, overwhelmingly from this top 20%, which tends to have educational privilege, and over the past 50 years has become much more insulated from the bottom 80%. And that's the leadership of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. That's the leadership of labor unions, and it's the leadership even of a lot of radical social movements. And there's this chasm between this political class and educated class and everyday working people. And it's not just a white problem, it's not just a people of color problem, it's across the color line, this class-based insularity. So that's some of what we have researched and developed trainings that we partner with social movement organizations to understand this insularity and to equip leaders in how to navigate it and how to break out of it and to understand the narratives that keep us in it and the class dispositions that keep us in it. So, you know, what this kind of looks like in a state like Pennsylvania is you've got Philadelphia on the one side, you've got Pittsburgh on the other side, and then you have this area in between that James Carville called Pennsyltucky, and a lot of liberals like to condescendingly call it that. But the fact is, decades ago, many of these areas were organized along progressive lines. The populist movement and then the labor movement. And not problem-free and not uncomplicated, but the areas that we have conceded and that common sense says like, oh, those are conservative areas, they've gotten more conservative. They were not always conservative, and they're still getting more conservative with every election cycle. So it's not a static situation, and we're trying to intervene in that. So I decided to move back to Pennsylvania, and that is some of where this starts. Do I point here, or that works? So I want to talk a little bit about, I moved back to Pennsylvania a little over 3 years ago after living in major cities like the Bay Area and New York and Minneapolis in order to organize, because I understood that most people like me who were raised conservative and raised working class and then find ourselves in more affluent and cosmopolitan and liberal areas, we tend to never come back. And that's, to me, is part of the explanation of how Trump wins in 2016. I moved back before Trump won, and with the goal of starting to organize. So Lancaster Stands Up started about a week and a half after the 2016 election, when 300 residents came together for a town hall meeting to, you know, we were reeling from this experience, what's going on, and we turned to each other. 400 people came 2 weeks later, 500 people came a month after that. Lancaster Stands Up has revolutionized grassroots organizing in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. This is a very conservative area. It's a conservative area with a city in the middle of it that has a slight majority people of color and a sea of white, but with a lot of working class people in the county that has gone conservative for decades and decades. And so this level of mobilization where we turned out 2,000 people when the Muslim ban happened, 3,000 people after the mass shooting in Florida, 1,000 people with 18 hours notice after what happened in Charlotte, North Carolina. These are unheard of numbers. And so I want to brag a little bit. And I want to not just brag, though, because I think that there's something to be learned with how we achieve this. It wasn't magical, and so I want to kind of demystify it. By the way, that photo is for the 1,000 people who came after Charlottesville. There's an Amish man in that photo. I don't know if you can spot him, but that's Lancaster County. So we now have over 1,000 dues-paying members as part of Lancaster Stands Up. We have 11 locals across our county, like Ephrata Stands Up and New Holland Stands Up, each of which was running an independent canvass out of their hub during this last midterm election. And my organization, Beyond the Choir, played a role in supporting Lancaster Stands Up from the beginning, doing a lot of training and leadership development and being a fiscal sponsor for the organization. So here are some of the keys to Lancaster Stands Up success. This is just the outline. I'm not going to go through the outline. I'm going to just go right into it. A place for everyday people. So what we're building is a place for everyday people to get involved. From the start of Lancaster Stands Up, we've been attuned to the people who are coming in the door for the first time, not to any kind of pre-existing left. And it kind of hurts my heart to say it, having spent more than 2 decades in the really deep in the U.S. left. But I think one of the big reasons we were successful is because there wasn't a left there before we started. And it's painful to say that, but with all its baggage, with all its specialized vocabulary, and we didn't have that. And so we were able to make a big splash and to kind of consolidate the momentum really quickly and to not have to deal with that. So, we have a very conscious narrative strategy, and what I mean by narrative strategy is we have a narrative that tries to articulate the struggle and articulate the kind of who are the culprits, who is the we. And there's a lot of words that we avoid using. We avoid words like activist and activism. We usually don't use words like resist. Not because we're trying to avoid fights. We're picking fights all the time. But because these words don't have much of a history in our area, and the only introduction that a lot of people have had to some of these words is through Fox News and through the dominant narrative. So we use familiar language and we communicate our values in different ways. So one of our big frames, we were very intentional about calling it Lancaster Stands Up, put the name of the city and the town in it. And we use the phrase Lancaster values a lot. Lancaster values healthcare for all. Lancaster values our immigrant sisters and brothers. And so we're contesting what Lancaster values are. We could say, well, Lancaster doesn't value that. Lancaster has a history of X, Y, and Z, and Lancaster is this screwed up place, and kind of place ourselves outside of Lancaster. But instead, we're contesting what Lancaster means. We're reserving city council chambers for our town hall meetings. We're having meetings in the public square, and basically giving people who are unfamiliar with protest and maybe a little frightened of those spaces, and also unfamiliar with electoral politics, we're kind of giving them permission and framing this as a mainstream thing that they can be part of, and we're very disciplined about that narrative. We do a lot of training and leadership development. I won't say very much about this, but it's just centrally important. We see that Trump getting elected has provided the biggest opportunity in my lifetime for everyday, my whole lifetime of organizing is like pulling teeth to get people involved, and suddenly the floodgates are open. However, we're at a historically weak period where over 40 years, progressive infrastructure has been weakening. We have a weak bench of who knows how to organize and mobilize, who knows how to run for office, and things, basic skills of how to facilitate a meeting, how to do promotion. And so we embed training and leadership development into everything we do. We're building leaders as part of our work. And one of the trainings we do is a piece that I'm going to show you and spend a good portion of my time on, and it is on understanding the populist moment we're in. So we don't just do skills training, we also do a lot of orientation about this political moment and how to understand it. And what we're finding is that things that I might have considered inside baseball a couple of years ago, people are really hungry. Everyday working people are really hungry to understand how we got here. And so we're providing some of that as training. We're moving from resistance to politics. So a lot of, for my lifetime, I've spent my life as a social movement organizer in a lot of outside spaces. And there's been a chasm between capital P politics and movement politics and community organizing. And our analysis in Lancaster Stands Up is that that chasm has only benefited the very powerful. And what's great is that after Trump was elected, that chasm has kind of intuitively disappeared for the base that we're organizing. They just like understand intuitively that, yeah, we have to stand against what Trump is doing and the right-wing populism that's emerging and the policies of the GOP. We have to protest, we have to do these things, but we also have to contest who's in power. And that, you know, of course we have to be legally compliant in our vehicles that we use, but other than that, we've been bridging this chasm and saying that it's in nobody's interest except the powerful to have this chasm. And specifically, I think one of the reasons Lancaster Stands Up has continued to grow, where a lot of indivisible groups, not to pick on Indivisible there, it's an incredible project. A lot of the groups that came out of this moment have had a hard time keeping up the momentum, is because by April of 2017, our leadership team realized that the 2018 elections were going to be a major center of gravity, and we started structuring our organization to get ready for that. We started membership so that we could have votes on who to endorse, and started staffing up and things like that. Inclusionary populism. I'm going to say more about this, and more about why I embrace it. I think we need a populist strategy, and it should be an inclusionary populist strategy. So I'll expand on what I mean by that and related to some of the other speakers' remarks. But what we mean is we need to pick economic populist fights about how the very powerful and the very wealthy have consolidated control of our economy and our political system, and how a political class has left everyday working people behind. And this is not the populism of your grandfather. We live in 2019, and I agree with the previous speaker that race and racial prejudice is central to understanding how right-wing populism is working. And a progressive inclusionary populist strategy has to center race and has to understand how race is a major structuring force in society, in American society. I don't want to project onto Canada, but you all can take what you want. So what does this look like? This isn't about downloading this kind of like fully intersectional deep analysis into our base or making it so that anybody who walks in the door has to already get it. It's not that at all. It's about having an analysis of social justice, racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, inform the strategies and the approach of how we go about things. So it informs what issue fights we pick and whose leadership we invest in building the most, which doors we're knocking, and how we articulate the struggle. And so that's a long game and an important approach. So just to paint a picture, like in the midst of our electoral campaign to try to elect Jess King for Congress, at the height of it in the summer, we kind of dropped everything we were doing for a little bit in order to fight and win a campaign against GEO Group, which was trying to privatize the prison reentry program, and to draw attention to a police brutality situation that was caught on tape and to put pressure on the city. And those choices matter. and they signal different things to different communities. And that is, you know, part of how we, I think part of this is everything we're doing, we see as a pedagogical process with our base. You can't download an analysis into a base, and having a radical analysis like is all for naught if you're just trying to like say it and have people like understand it intellectually. It's a process, and it has to do with how we relate to unfolding events and what our interventions are. So we say it's up to us, and this is the kind of independent political power piece. So what I mean by that is our training has reoriented our base to realize that this isn't, okay, so the modal response that we get when we knock doors is, I don't want to have anything to do with politics, right? Some kind of disenfranchisement to disgust from politics. People not liking either party. That is a major response that we get. And when we first started sending out volunteers canvassing, they would come back and be like, oh, they asked if we were Democrats, and we said yes, and they blew up on me about how they like hated the Democratic Party. And the funny thing is they were knocking the doors of registered Democrats. And so we had to reorient people to take that resistance to politics and that disenfranchisement from politics as an opening, as the beginning of a conversation, not the end of the conversation. And so, you know, you couldn't be a cheerleader for the Democratic Party when you meet that energy. You have to say something like, yeah, don't get me started about the Democratic Party. I mean, I would often say, don't get me started about the Democratic Party. I know people important to me in my life who lost everything from the financial meltdown. Nobody was held accountable. I was registered as an independent for a couple of years because I was so disgusted with all of them. But, you know, I realized one day that they're not going to change unless people like you and me get ourselves organized and make them. And that's why I'm excited about Jess King, who's running, who's not taking a dime from corporation, who's standing up for working people. She's a working mom. And that kind of conversation moved a lot of people. And so we also say, you know, that's what I mean by it's up to us. We say nobody is going to fix this for us. It's up to us, everyday people, to get ourselves involved and to take our democracy. So I want to spend the rest of my time before we go into questions talking about what we call bottom versus top polarization. And so this is a bit more of a theoretical dive, and this really informs our thinking about how we landed in this populist moment and how to navigate it and how to understand the difference between what we call progressive populism and reactionary populism. And so this is how we're told polarization works in American society, right? There's the left, there's the right, and then there's these people who call themselves centrists, and we don't really know what that is. But this is what we're told, right? This is the discourse of the pundits and of both parties. And so in this, you know, you have the left and the right. You have the corresponding labels liberal and conservative. And in the United States, we're told that we have the corresponding parties, Democrat and Republican. In Lancaster Stands Up, and then in the Jess King for Congress campaign, which emerged in the milieu of Lancaster Stands Up, we would take pains to avoid invoking this polarization. And so we wouldn't use these words, but we also just wouldn't use catchphrases like gun control. It didn't mean we were avoiding fights on issues. It meant we were presenting them in new ways that would shake up people's preconceptions. The reason we would avoid these frameworks like the plague is because once this is invoked, people tend to be in one of four positions, and it's a fixed position. Those four positions are they either identify on the one side, they identify on the other side, they proudly proclaim themselves a moderate centrist, again, whatever that means, or a lot of the people we were encountering alienated from the whole thing, right? And so when you invoke this, people know where they stand and they don't want to move. But when you talk about values, when you tell your story, or when you talk about specific issues through a values lens, people are kind of all over the place. That's one of the biggest lessons for me from the past 2 years, is that most people's politics are a lot more complex than we give credit for. and a lot of people are movable. Not all people, but a lot of people are. The other reason we don't like to use this is because it makes the center seem so reasonable, middle, balanced, moderate, even popular. So this is how centrists frame themselves and their interests. And we actually know that on economic policy, the most vocal, self-identified centrists tend to be defending the neoliberal status quo, which is not a popular position at all. It's actually an extreme position. So by avoiding this framework, we get to kind of pull that rug out from under that. So what do we do instead? You could take this and say, okay, so you don't polarize. No, we do polarize. We think polarization is critically important in political mobilization, and not something to be avoided, but something to think about strategically. How do you want to polarize? And it comes down to the question of who is the we, and what are the threats, and who are the culprits. So this is what we call the rhetorical structure of populism, the very basic. It's the elites, the corrupt establishment versus the people, right? That's basically populism as a non-ideological, because this could be left-wing, this could be right-wing, a non-ideological rhetorical structure where you say, we the people against that corrupt establishment, right? Watch Trump's final campaign ad. It's some of the most incredibly effective use of this rhetoric available. So what we do in our analysis is we complicate this a little bit to understand the very important moral and strategic differences between reactionary populism of Trump and the progressive inclusionary populism of, say, Ocasio-Cortez. So we introduce a third layer. We have the tippy top. These are not precise sociological categories. They do correspond with some more intricate categories. But the tippy top, we're talking about the 0.1%. We're talking about the billionaires, Wall Street, people with incredible economic power who also it has translated into incredible political power, right? But then we have under this what we're calling the political class. And here we're talking economically, the top 10 to 20%, people with educational privilege. And this is where we put the left, center, right, because this polarization is resonant within this class of people. And they think that everybody is still bought into these terms. But they're not, because there is the rest of us, and there is this rupture, this chasm that has emerged as neoliberalism has developed, as Wall Street and big corporations in the United States, I don't want to speak for Canada, have really captured the political class. And picture the top two pieces there kind of taking off like a rocket ship from the rest of everyday working people. They're all drinking their own Kool-Aid. I don't know what the expression is. And what this has done is it's made it ripe for somebody to come by and say, they've left us behind, because they have. And to articulate a new premise, a new narrative for a we the people, and to name culprits. And there's a Donald Trump version of this, and there's an Ocasio version of this. So Trump ran as a populist. I'm running out of time before questions, so I'm going to breeze through this last part. Reactionary populism. Here's how it works. It obfuscates the economic power at the very top. It taps into economic anxiety, but channels it into anger at social elitism and at scapegoats, usually racialized scapegoats. I want to talk about what I mean by that. So it pretends to punch up by pointing at the social elitism of upper strata liberals. This is why Trump's favorite targets are the media, academia, and Hollywood, right? And this works quite well for two reasons. One is that economic power feels abstract to people. It's like the weather. People are resigned to it. Whereas social condescension has a human face and there's a visceral reaction. So think basket of deplorables. And also the other reason is that when you're at the bottom, relative to your position, that looks a lot like the top. Even though it's not the very top, it's not where the economic power really lies, it looks like the top. And this is really important too, is that it gains outsider cred by punching up at the career politicians and establishment leadership of the Republican Party, in our case in the US. So we often think of Trump and the Tea Party as conservatives. It's very imprecise. They were an extreme faction that came to power partly by opening and insurgency against the party leadership. And that was absolutely essential to their rise to power. Absolutely essential. And there's a lesson in that for us. And then we know it really punches down at the most vulnerable by strategically fomenting prejudice. So Trump's favorite scapegoats are Muslims and immigrants, but there are others as well. And in so doing, it cements a we that is exclusionary. So there is a deep solidarity felt, but there are people who are outside of that we, who are otherized. That's how reactionary populism works. Ocasio also ran as a populist. Here's one of my favorite tweets of hers. I'm not running from the left, I'm running from the bottom. I'm running in fierce advocacy of working class Americans. That's my North Star, always has been, always will be. How does this populism work? Inclusionary populism. Punches up by pointing at the economic power at the very top. A big reason we have not been able to organize working people in this framework is because we've had a political party that is unwilling to pick these fights, because it has been effectively captured by big money. And so we call out, just like Trump called out the establishment leadership of the Republican Party, but not for really substantive reasons, just for like kind of empty reasons. We're calling out the establishment leadership of the Democratic Party, but for substantive reasons, especially the way big corporations and Wall Street have taken over and how the Democratic Party has failed to find its voice in advocating for working people. And I don't mean working people as a euphemism for white working people. I mean all working people in the United States, just to be clear. So we also call out the divide and conquer strategies of the Republican Party. I don't have time to say more about that, but at the door in Lancaster County, both in the city, which is majority people of color, and in the county, which is large majority white, we engage in talking about race. And Demos's research about this is really worth looking at, about how to do this in a way that is effective, where you're talking about both economics and about race at the same time, to inoculate people essentially against their own prejudices. And then we articulate a we the people that really includes all of us, regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, country of origin. So there's a tacky rainbow graphic there to capture that. Last thing, you know, in some, it's a them that's small, powerful, and exclusive, and a multiracial working class, us. And we also say it's Bernie's them and Obama's us. Obama was better than maybe anyone in our country's history of articulating a we the people that was told from the point of view of those who fought to become part of we the people, abolitionists, civil rights activists, suffragettes, people at Stonewall. But he was always not very good at picking a fight with culprits, and that, I would argue, is the weakness of his presidency. He didn't want to name a villain. Bernie is very good at naming villains and did a lot better than anybody thought he would do, because that was his trick. He just kept naming the 1%, billionaires, right? But he was actually pretty bad at the us. He would just tack it on at the end. He'd be like, blacks and Jews and queers, we're all gonna get along, it's great. So we feel like we need a hybrid, and that's kind of what has been what we've done. So that's the end. This closes on a photo of 500 people coming out a week after we lost our congressional race in a district that got changed from R+6 to R+14 in the middle of the race. So 500 people came out, and we're still at it, and we're working to build in Lancaster.